We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning, Jeff Reifman. Jeff Reifman is a technology consultant, writer, and activist, and he was co-author of the I-103 campaign, the initiative that would have ended corporate personhood here in Seattle. And he is here to talk about Microsoft's Nevada tax dodge. Jeff, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
So start out, tell us, how did you get involved and when did you discover this tax dodge?
Well, I worked at Microsoft for about 8 years, up until 1999. And towards the end of my stay there, I was just having a conversation with someone who happened to mention that they had been sent to Reno. They were in the IT group to help set up this big server farm, or like some big, their back-end IT there. And I said, oh, why are they doing that in Reno? And he said, well, it saves us on taxes. So that was in the back of my mind. And years later, when I pitched this story to the Seattle Weekly, I said, let's examine what kind of citizen is Microsoft in the community. And they were really into the story. And so I started looking into what was that. One of the things that I looked into was, what was this Reno operation about?
All right. And what did you find out?
Well, basically, they set up in Reno to account for between 30 and 50% of their revenue worldwide, so that they could avoid this tax called the royalty tax in Washington state. And the royalty tax is kind of a very specific tax. It's part of the business and occupation tax in Washington state. It's a strange tax, and the way it was written was kind of strange, but it's a tax, and that was the law, that you had to pay tax on licensing revenue in the state of Washington to your worldwide customers.
All right. So, and how much tax are we talking about?
Well, so when Microsoft started this, it was relatively small for them, about $40 million a year. But that was 1997. And initially, the royalty tax rate was 1.5% of all of your worldwide licensing revenue. But the software industry, which is largely Microsoft in Washington state, lobbied the legislature and got a preferential tax rate. So the rate was actually 0.484% after 1998. And then around that time, Microsoft's business started to completely grow and boom. And so the amount of savings grew to between $80 and $100 million a year annually of taxes that weren't being paid to the state of Washington. And then this added up over time, because this went on for about 13 years. And then we'll also have to include the interest and the penalties that the Department of Revenue generally assesses against people who don't pay their taxes. So essentially, we were looking at $1.5 billion in savings that Microsoft did not pay in taxes to the state of Washington. And if you actually calculate these figures at the 1.5% tax rate before Microsoft lobbied to reduce the tax rate, we're talking about $4.37 billion in tax savings for Microsoft.
So originally they set up they got their situation in Nevada, and then when did the changing the royalty rate kick in?
Actually, it's interesting. They seem to, the state couldn't provide a lot of details about who did the lobbying when back then, because it was a little while ago. But they seem to have changed the tax rate, but the company went ahead and opened the office in Nevada anyway.
All right. So,
it's a good lesson that even when you give companies what they want to encourage them to like stay in a region, they'll still sometimes do whatever they want to. So we don't often, when we give tax breaks to corporations, we don't always get anything in return.
So, any info on who led that lobbying effort to change the rates back then?
No, that was kind of fuzzy. The Department of Revenue couldn't really provide me much information on that. It was just sort of generally the software industry lobbied the legislature and was successful to cut the tax rate by about 2/3.
And the legislature doesn't have any records on that either?
It's not an issue that I looked into very deeply, because we know that the lobbying operation in Washington state is today it's largely Microsoft makes up a big part of it, and who funds it.
So technically this isn't illegal then, because it was incorporated in the law.
Well, so the questions of legality really are complicated. And so the state of Washington made an administrative decision not to pursue Microsoft, collecting these taxes from Microsoft. And the state of Washington's in the Department of Revenue made administrative decisions that they didn't think that they could legally win a lawsuit against Microsoft, so therefore they wouldn't pursue it. But there actually are a lot of legal issues that one could raise if they wanted to contest this. So one of the some of the common themes, and this gets a little bit wonky and technical, but nexus is an issue in taxation where you have the money being made from the licensing business at Microsoft. All that technology, all that software is built here in Redmond. The company has more than 40,000 employees here, 95 physical sites. No one's going to argue that that without Washington State's Microsoft operation, that revenue, that licensing revenue, could even exist. Another thing is that a lot of states use something called the step doctrine, that if a company makes an artificial step just to avoid taxes, that the courts will invalidate that accounting step and force the corporation to pay the taxes. And it's called the step doctrine. And if you look largely at what the Nevada operation started to be at the beginning and was about for the longest time, it's really a step in order so that Microsoft can pretend with a sleight of hand that those licensing revenues are based in Nevada where there's no tax, compared to, as opposed to that they're actually generated in Washington where we have this 0.484% tax. And so the step doctrine is one legal issue. Another issue is when we talk about royalties and software licenses, it's a category of the law called intangible property, because like the software licensing are digital goods. They're not like airplanes like with Boeing. They're not retail boxes of software like the Windows box you'd buy. We're talking about the hundreds of thousands of copies of Windows and Office that get sold to big corporations and just duplicated electronically. And there is law, like there's an appeals court decision in Louisiana where the court said that when it comes to taxing intangible property that's not physical, that the states can look at where the company is based and where its operations are based, and again, nexus, and use that to assert their taxing authority. So when we talk about one of the problems with this whole tax dodge is Microsoft's influence in Olympia and over the administrative arm of the state government. And so these choices that are being made not to collect taxes on Microsoft are questionable. And when the law was changed in 2010, which we'll get into, Governor Gregoire appointed now Congresswoman Susan Del Bene to actually run the Department of Revenue. Now, Susan, I actually used to work with her at Microsoft. She's a great person, but she was an ex-Microsoft executive. She'd been at the company 15 years, and now she's running the tax department. And her husband, Kurt, who I also used to work for, is actually, I think he's now the president of the Microsoft Office division. So there's a lot of questionable influence and relationships here that lead to the administrative decisions not to enforce the royalty tax law.
I believe they just had this week in the Seattle Times a op-ed talking about how this year's budget is being written by two ex-Microsoft employees, and it was being paraded as, and this is something good.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sharon Chan's editorial in the Seattle Times, she was also saying that she also expressed some concerns about how Microsoft runs some of its businesses, and maybe it's not a great idea. But yeah, she was not really critical, and she left out some huge facts. So she talked about Ross Hunter, is a 17-year ex-Microsoft executive who's now running the budgeting process in Olympia, and she happened to just ignore and leave out a big part of the history of Ross's role in the Nevada tax operation. So Ross used to work at Microsoft, and then in 2010, he led changes to the law. He was chair of the Finance Committee of the Washington State Legislature, and he pushed through a bill for the budget that basically gave Microsoft formal amnesty on their $1.5 billion tax dodge, interest, and penalties. And then also, he changed the definition of the royalty tax. So where the royalty tax for the longest time was a tax on worldwide sales, Representative Hunter's bill changed it so that now the royalty tax is very diminished. You only pay taxes on sales to Washington state customers. And so this is obviously a huge victory for Microsoft, even though even though they continue this practice in Nevada, and even though the state wasn't enforcing the tax on them, they were getting a lot of flack, partly through me bringing up these issues publicly. And so by changing the law, they're not actually dodging the tax anymore because the tax has been changed. And that's kind of how the way things work in Olympia right now is Microsoft has a lot of influence there and gets what it wants.
How did Ross Hunter justify cutting such significant potential funds for the Washington state budget?
Yeah, it's pretty awful. As I was raising these issues before that law changed in 2010, Hunter sent around some talking points to refute some of the arguments and facts that I was bringing to the surface. And he said that changing this law might actually encourage companies to bring their operations back from Nevada. And he also I forget, I don't know where this quote was, but he was telling people that it would raise revenue for the state, that we would actually earn more royalty revenue from corporations in Washington if we changed the law. And actually, a couple of weeks ago, I checked with the state 2 years later now, are we making more money or less money with the new law? And we're making less, actually. That may change over time. But Hunter never really intended for this law to lead to Microsoft moving its Nevada operations back or for it to lead to substantially more revenue. This law was changed to give Microsoft cover and a formal blessing for their Nevada operation.
But even following the logic on just the changing the tax from all products,
worldwide sales, yeah.
Which obviously is a large pool, to just Washingtonians, I mean,
it's like a 99.5% tax cut for Microsoft by doing that. I mean, it's.
But he's just taxing his constituents at that point.
Well, yeah, and this gets kind of also wonky and technical. As I said at the beginning, the royalty tax being a tax on worldwide sales was always a little bit weird. It's an unusual tax, and what they were doing in apportioning the royalty tax, it's a common practice that's being done across the country where states are focusing on taxing sales within their region. So there is some logic to it, but there are several dozen categories of the business and occupation tax, and the primary focus of the bill was to apportion the services revenue so that they could tax fees that banks were charging customers in Washington state, which was kind of a big cash cow. And Ross decided that the royalty tax needed to be apportioned at this time. It was the only other category of B&O that was just thrown into the bill. And that's why it was so suspicious. And really, it was designed to be a gift for Microsoft.
So was there, since you were involved back when they were making these changes in 2010, what was the media response? What was the legislators? I mean, obviously they passed it, but was there any serious discussion?
This is a big concern. And I think maybe we could just, before I answer that, let's talk about education in Washington state. So, Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation are big supporters of education here. And the Gates Foundation, I believe, has a number of initiatives to support education in Washington state. Steve Ballmer has said that it's really important for Washington to invest more in education, that our taxpayers need to do more to fund education. Brad Smith, the man behind running the Nevada tax operation for Microsoft, he's the executive vice president and general counsel. He is always talking about the importance of education and graduating more technology graduates in Washington, and I agree that this is a hugely important issue. So right now, where we are with the state budget is that Governor Inslee and the legislature are trying to find $1.2 to $1.4 billion to put back into the education budget, and this is as a result of, things have gotten so bad in Washington that the courts have ordered the legislature to restore funding to education. And so since 2008, the state has cut $4 billion from education, from K through 12 and higher ed, and it's been a travesty. And and you mentioned Sharon Chan's article. She said at Microsoft, everybody gets really happy when they create a new billion-dollar business, and that's really the goal there, is to create new billion-dollar businesses. Well, when you take $4 billion away from any institution, you're destroying it. You're devastating it. And so that's what we've done in Washington. We've cut $4 billion from our K through 12 and university education. Very few institutions could survive that. And so when we talk about quality of education, how can we even start that conversation, like whether we're doing a good job, when we take $4 billion away from that system? And so I mentioned earlier that if not for Microsoft's lobbying and Nevada tax dodging, the company would have paid $4.37 billion more in taxes. So I'm not saying that Microsoft is the cause of our $4 billion in education cuts, but there is a big coincidence that these numbers are in the same ballpark. And so when Ballmer, Gates, and Smith talk about the importance of education, on the other hand, they are using these sophisticated corporate mechanisms to deprive the state of revenue that would otherwise go to the schools.
And you, during your investigation on the 2004 article at the Seattle Weekly, you had spoken actually with Brad. His name is eluding me.
Brad Smith.
Brad Smith.
Yeah, do you want to play the clip?
Yeah, let's play that real quick. It's a 3-minute clip, and we can hear directly from the man himself. So this is your phone interview. This is a segment from your phone interview with Brad Smith in 2004.
Yeah, I was doing the article Citizen Microsoft for Seattle Weekly, and just to be clear, we had permission to record the interview with him.
All right, here goes.
So, in my research over the past 8 years, it appears that Microsoft's reported more than $60 billion in OEM revenue. And I guess I'm interested in how the issue of recording this revenue in Nevada to avoid the B&O tax has been debated internally at Microsoft.
Well, the principal focus of discussion inside the company and with people in state government here at times has been both the focus on revenue generation for the state of Washington and job creation in the state of Washington.
Okay.
And, obviously the company did make a decision, I'm not remembering exactly how many years ago, to put Microsoft Licensing Incorporated in Nevada.
Right.
In part to, recognize the lower tax rate that was in place there. And there have been times when people in state government have mentioned to us the issue of whether we might move that back to the state of Washington. The reality is that in the scheme of things, the impact is not very significant, either for the company or for the state, either the state government or the state economy.
So when I've looked at the numbers, looking at data I've received from the state, it seems like Microsoft records no more than 10% of its royalty revenue in Washington, if any of it. And that seems like a significant number to a biennial budget. Can you confirm that or provide data to refute that?
I don't know the number myself. I'm sure we could find it, but in a sense, I guess I would say it's probably not that surprising when you consider the amount of our revenue that is generated in the state of Washington. We're a global company, and one of the interesting or defining characteristics of Microsoft is that over half of our revenue is generated outside the United States.
So, but the laws of Washington here do require that worldwide royalty revenue is reported is taxable under the B&O. So that's not saying that you guys you're not breaking the law. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that under the rules in Washington, all the worldwide royalty revenue would be taxable here.
Yes, although I'd also say that the law is actually structured in such a way so as to permit a company to do precisely what we are doing.
All right, so that was the segment from your interview with Brad Smith in 2004. So what else has come out of the 2010 legislative changes?
Well, you asked me kind of what was the conversations then, and I honestly, I'm concerned about the Washington State Legislature. My conversations with representatives then gave me a sense that not very many of them understood what was happening, what was behind the change to the royalty tax, what was behind the called a field audit clause that was giving amnesty to Microsoft on its back taxes. And I started to get the sense that people don't really want to take on Microsoft in the legislature, which isn't surprising, but I didn't realize that was happening in our democratically controlled legislature. That was in 2010. And one of the big issues, I wrote an article a couple weeks ago about how the Department of Revenue has been using Yelp to search for nightclubs that are offering patrons the opportunity to dance, and then assessing back taxes against communities like community nightclubs like the Century Ballroom, who was assessed with, I think, a $250,000 tax bill that they've been trying to pay off and having to hold fundraisers to pay that off. Last week, the legislature was arguing to raise funding. Should they extend the beer tax, and then that seemed too controversial, so they were looking at extending taxes on janitorial services. And at that same week, Microsoft recorded record revenue of $20 billion, half of that probably from software licensing. This concerns me. The Washington State Legislature seems to be complicit. They don't want to take on Microsoft with this issue. They don't want to look at why we cut $4 billion from education, how Microsoft saved $4.37 billion in taxes, and they seem to be looking for nickel and dime solutions to what is a much bigger problem. And I think it's damning, and it concerns me. And you could hear Brad Smith in his interview. He was saying, this really isn't a big deal to the state budget. This really isn't a lot of money. I mean, he's just lying. And if Microsoft wants to prove that anything that I've said here is wrong, they can just publicly release how much money they paid in royalty taxes from the years 1997 to 2010. And the company has refused to do so.
Another interesting point that you brought up in the documents that you have online at your website, which is
MicrosoftTaxDodge.com. Yeah, and we've put some links up today for listeners.
Is that Microsoft has used King County courts in the past, yet states?
Yeah. So, when it's convenient for them, they want to use the legal system to they've actually sued. Microsoft Nevada has used King County courts to sue customers that haven't paid their bills. And in one case that I found, they recovered $8 million. And if you ask people in the courts here, the courts have been defunded by the budget cuts over the last number of years, and they're struggling. Someone would say that they're having critical funding issues. So not only has Microsoft acted by setting up Nevada to deprive the state of revenues that would support the courts, but then Microsoft burdens the courts by allowing Microsoft Nevada to start lawsuits here. And it's just more hypocrisy from Microsoft.
Yeah. And they have, I have to imagine, do you have a sense for how large Microsoft's legal teams are?
I mean,
many of the 40,000 are?
They're massive,
So developments since 2010, have there been any further developments besides that we have, again, as the Times noted, to ex-Microsofties designing our new budget?
Well, we had folks like Steve Ballmer actively supporting the charter schools amendment. So part of what's happening here is that when a company like Microsoft is allowed to save billions of dollars on taxes that never make it to the general fund, and then those billionaires turn around and take their savings and apply them to the political process or to fund their own projects, we're essentially letting them privatize the tax system and choose where money from the tax system gets spent. And that's just not the way things are supposed to work. I don't get to choose where my taxes get spent. And so if one thing that we've seen some of these monies that Microsoft executives have saved it gets put into the political process to get what they want. And I'd rather see those monies go to the general fund and let the general fund get, the decisions about the general fund get made by the legislature like it's supposed to in the Constitution.
You have been following this since 2004. How has the rest of the corporate media done on covering this issue?
So on MicrosoftTaxDodge.com, we have a link to all the media coverage. And across the internet, across the country, even some international press, we've gotten great coverage for this issue. Even recently, the local media has really been hesitant to cover it. And I'm really appreciative today of you giving me time to really explain to people about what's been going on. Because I think these issues are they're critical to the context of our repetitive billion-dollar budget deficits and education deficits. So for people to really understand why we're struggling to fund education, they have to understand Microsoft's role in this. So I went and met with executive editor of the Seattle Times, David Boardman, and 5 of his journalists in 2010. Spent about 2 hours with them, talking with them about Microsoft's tax dodge. And David was really eager to cover this and said that they would do so. And none of that ever materialized. As far as I know, the Seattle Times has given 1 sentence of ink in the last 10 years to this issue. And that just is flabbergasting to me. How are readers going to understand what's happening in Olympia and why we don't have money if they don't have some awareness of Microsoft's tax actions?
All right. So just 2 minutes left. So if you were put in charge of Washington State's budget, what would you do? What would you change?
Well, so actually, it's the revenue structure that's broken in Washington. The majority of states have income taxes and sales taxes, and sales taxes and income taxes. And Washington State is heavily reliant on the sales taxes and the business and occupation taxes. So I think to improve our budgeting system on an ongoing basis, we have to have some kind of income tax, like the one that was proposed on people with incomes over $200,000. Sales taxes. Washington State has the most regressive tax in the country, meaning that poor people pay a higher percentage of their revenue than wealthy people, or a higher percentage of their income than wealthy people. And the reason is because we pay almost 10% sales tax here in Seattle, and the state portion of that I think is about 5 or 6%. So to fix the budgeting system, you have to fix the revenue collection system. The other thing I would say is that you have to crack down on tax avoiders. And so Ross Hunter made some comments about we have to crack down on these these mailbox business, these PO box businesses in Nevada that aren't real operations. Well, Microsoft has 400 or 500 people in a very large building in Reno, but that's essentially a post box to a company that has earned $650 billion in the last 15 years. When you're looking at large companies, tax avoidance, tax evasion, it looks different than a mom and pop operation that opens up a post box. So I'd say that Washington State has to be serious about looking at how these sophisticated operations have deprived the state of revenue that we need to fund schools.
All right. Well, with that, we're pretty much out of time. How can people find out more about this issue?
They can check out MicrosoftTaxDodge.com, and there's a bunch of links up there today.
All right. Well, with that, we're out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us today.
Thank you, Mike.